Ethan Walker lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where every house looked a little too perfect, and every smile lasted just long enough to hide what lay beneath. His husband, Mark, was an accountant who spent most nights surrounded by spreadsheets and phone calls that never seemed to end. Their marriage wasn't unhappy, it was simply silent. Conversations had become short exchanges about bills, groceries, or what show to stream next. Laughter used to fill their kitchen. Now it was replaced by the hum of Mark's laptop and the tick of the wall clock. Ethan often found himself wondering when routine had replaced affection, and why the sound of his own thoughts had become louder than the voice of the man he loved. That evening, the air was heavy with the smell of rain. Ethan was washing dishes when sudden flashes of red and blue lights spilled through the window. His heart jumped. For a moment he thought there had been an accident. He wiped his hands and stepped outside. A police cruiser was parked at the curb, headlights glowing through the mist. A tall man in uniform stepped out, Officer Daniel Reeves. His voice was calm and polite as he explained that the department was conducting a routine safety check after a neighbor reported a suspicious vehicle earlier that week. Ethan nodded, his anxiety fading as Daniel's tone stayed friendly and reassuring. Their exchange was brief, just names, a few questions, and a small smile, but something about the officer's presence lingered. Daniel thanked him for his cooperation and was about to leave when he noticed Ethan's nervous fidgeting. "Everything okay, sir?" he asked softly. Ethan blinked, surprised by the concern in his voice. "Yeah, just been a long day," he replied. Daniel nodded, tipping his hat slightly. "Take care of yourself," he said before walking back to his car. The taillights disappeared into the wet street, leaving Ethan standing in the faint glow of his porch light, his heart unexpectedly unsteady. Inside, Mark barely looked up when Ethan returned. "Police outside?" he asked, eyes still on his screen. Ethan nodded, explaining what happened, but Mark just murmured, "Good, they're checking." The conversation ended there. Ethan sat across from him, watching the man he'd built a life with, and felt the strange emptiness widen between them. Later, while lying in bed, he kept replaying that small moment on the porch, the warmth in Daniel's voice, the brief connection that shouldn't have mattered but somehow did. The next morning came with clear skies. Ethan tried to shake off the thoughts. It was silly, he told himself. It was just a police check, nothing more. Yet as he drove to work, he found himself scanning every intersection, half expecting to see that patrol car again. The idea made him smile, then frown, unsure what he was hoping for. A few days later, fate granted him an answer. While jogging through the local park, earbuds in, Ethan noticed a familiar figure sitting on a bench near the fountain, a man in casual clothes, a dog tugging at its leash. It was Daniel. For a moment, Ethan considered running past without saying anything, but Daniel looked up and their eyes met. Recognition lit his face. "Hey, routine check guy," he called out with a grin. Ethan laughed, embarrassed but pleased. They chatted about the weather, about the park, about how Daniel's dog refused to chase the same stick twice. It felt natural, easy, as if they'd known each other longer than a few minutes on a rainy street. They spoke for nearly half an hour before Ethan realized the time. As he stood to leave, Daniel said, "Maybe I'll see you around, Ethan." The casual mention of his name sent a quick flutter through Ethan's chest. He nodded and jogged off, smiling in spite of himself. For the first time in months, someone had looked at him like he mattered, not as a husband filling a role, but as a person worth listening to. That evening, Mark came home late. Dinner was quiet again. Ethan tried to start a conversation, mentioning the park, the weather, even an upcoming neighborhood meeting, but Mark just nodded absently, eyes on his phone. When Ethan finally asked, "Do you ever feel like we don't talk anymore?" Mark sighed, setting the phone down only long enough to say, "I'm tired, Ethan. Can we not do this tonight?" The wall between them grew thicker, built not from anger but from indifference. Ethan nodded, forcing a small smile, but his heart sank. Later, while washing the dishes alone, Ethan's mind drifted back to Daniel's friendly tone and the simple honesty of that short exchange. He realized it wasn't attraction that unsettled him. It was the reminder of how it felt to be seen, to be heard. That night, he stood by the window, staring at the empty street where the patrol car had once been, wondering why a stranger's kindness could stir emotions his marriage had long forgotten. As the lights in neighboring houses dimmed one by one, Ethan whispered to himself, "Maybe I just miss being happy." The words faded into the stillness of the room, unanswered. The clock ticked on. Somewhere in the distance, a faint siren echoed, and Ethan couldn't tell whether it was calling him back to reality or pushing him toward something new. All he knew was that a simple routine check had unsettled the quiet life he thought he understood, leaving behind a feeling he couldn't ignore. The following week slipped by quietly, though Ethan's thoughts refused to stay still. Every night he caught himself glancing out the window, half expecting to see that familiar police cruiser glide down the street. He told himself it was ridiculous, but when something has awakened long-dormant feelings, reason rarely wins. Then one evening, while taking out the trash, headlights swept across his driveway. The same black-and-white car idled for a moment before easing to a stop. Officer Daniel Reeves stepped out, not in uniform this time, but wearing a light jacket and jeans. "Evening, Ethan," he said with an easy smile. "Didn't mean to bother you. I was checking on a few houses after a false alarm nearby." Ethan tried to sound casual. "You make a habit of patrolling this block?" Daniel shrugged lightly. "Guess I just like this neighborhood." They both knew there was more behind that answer, but neither pushed. Daniel asked if Ethan had a minute to talk. They leaned against the hood of the car, the cool metal grounding them as conversation drifted from work to hobbies to the strange loneliness that can live inside a full life. Ethan admitted he used to paint, but hadn't touched a brush in years. Daniel listened, not with polite interest, but genuine care. It felt like breathing fresh air after years of recycled words. When Mark called from his business trip that night, his voice came through distant and distracted. "Everything okay at home?" he asked. Ethan hesitated, then replied, "Yeah, everything's fine." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. After hanging up, he stared at the silent phone and felt the weight of pretending press harder on his chest. The next day, Ethan found himself near the small coffee shop downtown. Through the window, he spotted Daniel sitting at a corner table, reading the paper. Their eyes met, and Daniel gestured toward the empty chair across from him. Ethan hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. What followed wasn't flirtation. It was relief. They talked about childhood, families, and the way both men had spent years trying to fit into expectations that never quite matched who they were. Daniel confessed that he'd once been married, too, but ended it when honesty became impossible to ignore. He said it not with pride, but with quiet regret. "It cost me friends, a house, a few good years," he said, stirring his coffee. "But it gave me peace." Ethan listened in silence. That word, peace, settled in his mind like a forgotten melody. They began to meet occasionally, always in public places, always keeping things proper. Yet each conversation grew more personal. Ethan realized he laughed more around Daniel than he had in months with Mark. Still, guilt followed him everywhere. When he returned home, he'd find Mark asleep on the couch, the television still playing, and the sight filled him with both tenderness and sorrow. One rainy night, Daniel parked near Ethan's street again. He texted, asking if Ethan was okay after a storm warning earlier. Ethan replied that he was fine but couldn't sleep. A few minutes later, Daniel sent, "Come sit in the car."
"Just talk." The street was quiet.
The world seemed wrapped in the sound of falling rain. Inside the car, warm air hummed from the vents. Daniel handed Ethan a cup of coffee. They spoke softly about fear of hurting others, fear of being alone, fear of the truth. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he admitted, "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." Daniel looked at him, eyes steady. "You're being human, that's all." They sat in silence, the rain tracing lines down the windows like tears neither could shed. There was no touch, no confession of love, only understanding that something real existed between them, something deeper than either had planned for. Ethan whispered, "I can't let this go on." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then don't lie to yourself anymore." When Ethan finally stepped out of the car, he saw another set of headlights turning onto the street. Mark's car, earlier than expected. For a split second, Ethan froze. Mark's gaze flicked from Daniel to Ethan, confusion crossing his face before hardening into something else. Realization. Daniel lowered his eyes respectfully and drove away, leaving Ethan standing in the driveway, soaked by the rain and by guilt he could no longer hide. Mark didn't speak at first. He simply asked, "Who was that?" Ethan opened his mouth, but no excuse came. Instead, he said the only truth he could manage: a friend. Mark's expression told him that word had lost all meaning. He went inside without another word. Ethan remained outside until the rain washed cold across his skin, knowing that the life he'd been protecting from change had already begun to unravel. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept hearing Daniel's voice in his head. Don't lie to yourself anymore. For the first time, Ethan realized that what began as a routine check had become something far more dangerous, a mirror reflecting the life he no longer wanted to live. And now, the cost of that realization was about to unfold in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Morning came heavy and gray. Ethan woke to the faint smell of coffee and the sound of quiet movement downstairs. For a moment, he hoped it was any other day, but the tension in the air reminded him it wasn't. When he entered the kitchen, Mark was sitting at the table, already dressed for work. His expression calm but distant. The silence between them felt louder than any argument could have been. "Do you want to talk about last night?" Mark asked, voice steady but soft. Ethan hesitated, then sat across from him. "I don't know where to start," he said. Mark folded his hands. "Maybe start with the truth." Ethan took a breath, words trembling on his tongue. "It wasn't what it looked like. He's someone I met by chance, someone who listened when I needed it." "But I know that's not enough to make this okay." Mark's gaze stayed fixed on the table. "Are you in love with him?" he asked quietly. Ethan shook his head, unsure. "I don't know. I just know I feel seen, and I haven't felt that in a long time." Mark exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. There was no anger, only exhaustion. "I don't hate you," he said after a pause, "but I think we both stopped trying a long time ago." His words carried more truth than blame. Ethan nodded, tears forming but refusing to fall. He had imagined this conversation 100 times over the years, but never thought it would feel like this, both painful and freeing. The following days passed in quiet waves. Mark moved into the guest room while they figured out what came next. They avoided heavy talks, speaking only about practical things: finances, furniture, schedules. The house felt larger, emptier, as if both of them had already begun to move on in separate directions. Ethan didn't see Daniel again for a while. He needed space to face himself without leaning on anyone else. He spent his evenings walking through the park, the same one where he and Daniel first talked. The world looked different now, clearer, sharper. The loneliness was still there, but so was a strange sense of relief. He was no longer pretending. One evening, while sorting through a drawer, Ethan found an old paintbrush. The bristles were stiff with time, but holding it sparked a memory of who he used to be before life became a series of routines. He set up a small easel by the window and began to paint again. Nothing complicated, just colors blending into the shape of a sky after rain. For hours, he painted in silence, letting the weight of unspoken feelings flow through the brush. Weeks later, Ethan received an invitation from a local community center asking for volunteers to help with a food drive. He signed up without thinking much about it. On the day of the event, he arrived early, arranging boxes and greeting people with a shy smile. Halfway through the morning, as he carried a crate of canned goods, a familiar voice spoke behind him. "Careful, artist. You'll drop those." He turned, startled, to see Daniel standing there, wearing a volunteer badge and the same warm smile. "Daniel," Ethan said softly, his surprise melting into relief. "I didn't know you worked here." Daniel shrugged. "I don't, just helping out today." They both laughed lightly, and the awkwardness faded. They spent the afternoon working side by side, talking about simple things: the center, the weather, the people coming in for help. There was no tension now, no unspoken guilt, just a quiet understanding between them. When the event ended, they walked outside into the golden light of sunset. The streets glowed warm and peaceful, the air cool and still. Daniel looked at Ethan and said with a half smile, Guess routine checks really can change lives. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, it turns out they do. There was no need for more. Whatever might come next didn't need to be defined. What mattered was that both men had found something valuable: truth, courage, and peace. When Ethan returned home that evening, the house felt different. Mark had moved the last of his belongings earlier that day, leaving a simple note on the counter. I hope you find what you're looking for. Ethan sat down, holding the note in his hands. For the first time in years, he didn't feel trapped or guilty. He just felt grateful for what had been and for what might still come. That night, he stood by the window again, the same one where he had once watched police lights flash across the glass. The street was quiet now, the world calm. He thought about how everything had started with something so ordinary: a routine check, a few kind words, a conversation in the rain. Yet that moment had unraveled an entire life and rebuilt it into something more honest. Ethan whispered to himself, "Love doesn't always come to stay. Sometimes it just comes to show you who you really are." The words lingered in the air, soft but certain. He turned off the light, took a deep breath, and smiled. A small, steady smile born not from excitement, but from peace. Outside, the sky stretched wide and clear. The storm had passed, and the night felt open, full of quiet possibilities.